Chapter 8 is about the descending motor tracts. Some of them are conscious and some of them are subconscious, as you can see in this slide. Cerebral cortex is responsible for conscious movements, and the brainstem, the pathways that are coming from brainstem, these are for subconscious movements. The cerebral cortex can send signals, make the decision by itself, or it may receive different signals from the other parts of the brain. For example, if there's information is receiving from cerebellum, those are the proprioceptors, so the joints are moving, and then that information is sent to cerebellum. Cerebellum is sending information to thalamus, and thalamus sends information to cerebral cortex, and then that will be a motor response. The cerebral cortex can make its own decision. Either way, it can send signals. So this is the descending motor pathway. It goes to the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia checks the signals if the patterns of movements are correct. So that's a good news. If it's not, then it cancels it or inhibits it. Those signals, there are two different pathways, and when we get to this chapter, I will show you the pathways. These signals are sent back to thalamus, so the thalamus then sends signals again to the cerebral cortex. Also, cerebral cortex sends motor information to the pons, and pons sends it through the middle cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellum, and then cerebellum checks it and fine-tunes the movements, and then sends it back to thalamus, and thalamus sends it to cortex of brain. The basal ganglia and cerebellum also they are connected to brainstem, so that the signals that are coming out of the brainstem is influenced by the signals from the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, and the same thing with the cerebral cortex. So both of them are influenced by basal ganglia and cerebellum. And then the signals that are going down to the lower motor neurons and then to the muscles, so it can be lateral motor system or the medial motor system. So the lateral motor system is here, so on the lateral part of the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and the medial motor system is on the medial side of the anterior horn of the spinal cord. But remember that not all signals are sent from brainstem to the spinal cord, because some of them could be sent to the cranial nerve nuclei. So it's not, the image is not here, but I will talk about it later. Okay, so the lateral ones are for the limbs and the fine movements, and here is the medial one is more for posture and balance, and these are for trunk muscles. So this is just a general overview of different tracts. I can start from here. So you can see this is the anterior or frontal lobe, and this is the precentral gyrus. It can send signals down to the spinal cord, and this is the corticospinal tract. But as you can see, there's two different types. The anterior corticospinal tract sends signals to the proximal muscles, and the lateral corticospinal tract sends it to the distal muscles. And if I come here, then the cortex of the brain is influencing the brainstem, but these signals are coming from the brainstem. The upper motor neurons are connected to the different parts of the cortex of brain, but these pathways are named because they initiate from the brainstem. So it can come from the colliculi, so then it will influence mostly the proximal muscles. It can come from the red nucleus that is the distal muscles. It can come from the vestibular nuclei, which is the balance, and that's also affecting mostly the proximal, mostly the trunk muscles, but it can also influence the limbs. And coming from the reticular formation, these fibers and also influence different muscles. Okay, and I will show you the pathways later. And in this image, if you look at it, so the trunk, okay, the shoulder and the hip girdle muscles and the neck muscles are influenced by the medial pathways, which is the anterior corticospinal tract and the brainstem pathways, which are these ones. And the limbs are influenced by lateral corticospinal tract and also rubrospinal tract. So in this image you can add rubrospinal if you want, but it's already here. If you want to add it here, you can do that. So this somehow in your textbook it's not shown there, but they are also influencing the distal part, especially the rubrospinal is influencing the upper limbs. Now let's start with the corticospinal tract. So there is one is called lateral corticospinal tract. So this is for starting from the cortex of brain, and then it going down to the corona radiata, and then from there it goes to the internal capsule, a posterior part of the internal capsule, going to midbrain, and this is the cerebral peduncle. So cerebral peduncles, if you remember, carrying sensory and motor fibers. So these are the descending motor fibers. Then it goes to the pons, and from there it goes to pyramid. In the anterior part of pyramid, it creates the interior part of the medulla, it creates pyramids. So in the lower part of medulla, it will some of the fibers will continue downward, and some of the fibers will go to the other side, so or cross the midline, and that's called the decussation. So about 85-90% crossing the midline, that will create the lateral corticospinal tract. So here it will be the tract is located in the lateral white column. This is the lateral white column, and about 10 to 15% are going down in the same area, so anteriorly, and then it's located in the anterior white column of the spinal cord. So this pathway, it will synapse with the lower motor neuron in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So this is the upper motor neuron, and this is the lower motor neuron. Okay, so the lower motor neuron, if you remember, it is in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So the function of the lateral corticospinal tract, this is conscious, skilled motor activity, so it's voluntary motor activity, so the soy cortex of the brain is involved, and it is important for the limb muscles, and it crosses the midline. As you can see, it crosses the midline. And here in the spinal cord, if you look at it, these neurons are supplying different muscles. So extensors, the muscles that are innervated by this part of the anterior horn, these are the extensor muscles, and the flexor muscles that are innervated by the posterior part of the anterior horn, and the distal muscles are located laterally, and the proximal muscles that are supplied by these neurons are located more medially. This image is the same thing, it's a nicer image. I just put it there if you think like you learn better this way by better images than the ones that you have in your textbook, but the information is the same thing. So remember, this is the decussation that happens, it crosses the midline, so it goes on the lateral white column. and below L2 it is there is no trunk fibers, only lateral corticospinal tract is there, so there is no anterior corticospinal tract is there. And the arrangement is from medial to lateral, so that is arm, trunk, and legs, so it's like that. So distal, see, distal is here. This is the leg, so it's more arm, trunk, and leg is like that. And here is the anterior corticospinal tract, so the upper motor neuron is located in the cortex of the brain, and this is the corona radiata, this is internal capsule, cerebral peduncle, it goes through the corticospinal tract and the pons, and the medulla. This is the pyramid, so this is the upper part of the medulla, and this is the lower part that is already crossed here somewhere, so it's not shown here, so somewhere it crosses around here. Then it goes down, most of it goes down in the same direction, does not cross the midline, and then synapses and the anterior horn, and some of them will cross on the other side. So anterior corticospinal tract is bilateral, right? So it's both sides, and it's involving the neck muscles, the torso muscles, and the shoulder and hip girdle muscles, so it's bilateral. Neck muscles are also supplied by some other pathways, okay, but the torso and the shoulder girdles and hip girdles are more important. And they are important for posture and balance. So if you are doing anything with one of your limbs, that is the lateral corticospinal tract, then the anterior corticospinal tract is keeping your posture and balance. A third pathway that's coming from cortex of brain, and this is also conscious, so that is the corticobulbar. This does not go to the spinal cord, this is the one that goes to the brain stem, and this, the upper motor neuron is located in the cortex of the brain. This is corona radiata, and then this is the internal capsule. So this is an image of internal capsule. This is the anterior limb, this is the genu or knee, and this is the posterior limb of internal capsule. So the corticobulbar tract, corticospinal tract, you can see that the different locations. Corticobulbar is in the genu, and the corticospinal is here in the posterior limb, so that is the arm, trunk, and leg. That is the somatotropic arrangement. So once it passes through there, then it goes to different nuclei of the cranial nerves. Most of them are bilateral. So here you can see this is the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, so it's bilateral. For the face, okay, so the upper part of the face is bilateral, and the lower part of the face is contralateral, so it crosses the midline. So if there is any damage, usually if it is the upper part is damaged, there is a weakness there because this is bilateral. But if the lower part, it can be total paralysis, because here you do not get bilateral innervation, you are just getting it contralaterally. But here and the upper part, you are getting bilateral. If one is damaged, then this one is still coming from the other side, so still some muscle movement is there. There's weakness, but there is still some movements there. Nucleus ambiguous, so this is for pharyngeal muscles, this is bilateral, and the cranial nerve 12, this is for tongue. Most of them are bilateral except the genioglossus, which is crossed, and when the time comes I will show you. And for the cranial nerve 11, sternocleidomastoid is on the same side, ipsilateral, and for the trapezius muscle it is contralateral, it crosses the midline. And again, corticobulbar tract, it is conscious, okay. Now those are the subconscious pathways. Okay, so one of them is called the vestibulospinal tract. This is part of the medial pathway. So starting from the vestibular nuclei. Vestibular nuclei are connected with the vestibulum of the inner ear, so that is important for balance. So there is two vestibular nuclei. One is the medial and the other one is the lateral one. So this one is starting from medial vestibulonuclear tract, from the medial vestibular nucleus, I mean medial vestibular nucleus, and the tract is also called descending MLF, medial longitudinal fasciculus. So this is supplying the neck muscles bilaterally, so you can see it comes down and supplies both sides. So this is the proximal muscles, and bilaterally it's important for coordination of head and eye movements. So if the eye is moving, your head also moves, so it can follow an object. Same thing you can see in this image. So this is the medial vestibular nucleus, and it can supply both sides. The lateral vestibulospinal tract is coming from the lateral vestibular nucleus, and it stays on the same side, okay, and goes all the way down to the lower limb. They are important for excitation of extensor muscles and inhibition of the flexor muscles. So they are important for posture and balance. Once again, for excitation of extensor muscles and inhibition of the flexor muscles. Reticulospinal tract, that is coming from the reticular formation. So it's a bunch of nuclei in the brainstem, and they have different functions. One of them is for primitive motor behavior that does not require any specific skills. For example, you're walking in the street and somebody is coming toward you and you don't want to bump on that person, and you're just moving to the side. Or if you're walking, there's a pothole and then you want to jump on top of it, so you don't, your leg does not go into the pothole. So non-skilled movements. There's also integration of the proximal and distal muscle, and this is important for posture and balance. Another function is for tone. So muscle tone is important. Normally, the reticulospinal tract does not have a lot of influence on the movements, because the corticospinal tract is more influencing the body. But if there is any damage in the corticospinal tract, then the reticulospinal tract take over, and that's why you see increased tone. And this also participates in breathing, because reticular formation is important for breathing, right? So that the breathing centers are in the medulla and also in pons. So most of these movements are at subconscious level, but the cortex of the brain can influence respiratory muscles. And you can take, for example, extra breath. You can take deep breath, or you can hold your breath, so it can influence this pathway. Also, it's important for emotional motor behavior or motor response, and that is activation of monoaminergic system, which is dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, and depends on the mood and emotional status of a person. You can see that the posture, the gesture, and the facial expression of a person changes. For example, somebody is excited is different than somebody that is sad or depressed, or somebody that is happy. They have different facial expression, or somebody that's surprised. So that this pathway influencing that. And And then is the tectospinal tract, so that is coming from tectum. You can see the tectum located in dorsal part of the brainstem, so you have the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Here is shown only the superior, is more important, but you also have it from the inferior colliculi. Most of them cross the midline, but some of them can also have it on the same level. You can have bilaterally, but most of them cross the midline. And this is supplying the head and neck muscles, and it's important for visual and auditory reflex. For example, you see something suddenly and then you turn your head, or you hear something and you turn your head, and it's a reflex, so the tectospinal tract is responsible for it. And the rubrospinal tract, that is coming from the red nucleus of the midbrain. It crosses the midline, and it is supplying the distal limbs, specifically upper limbs. It's important for the tone, for the movements, and for the posture of the upper limbs, especially the hands. So for fine movements of the hands, it's important. And this table and the table in the next slide, these two tables are just a summary of these pathways. So these three pathways that are coming from cortex of the brain, so these are conscious, so cortex, conscious, both of them with C, so easy to remember. Lateral corticospinal tract, anterior corticospinal, and then corticobulbar. They are all originating from motor areas of the frontal lobe, and their target is in the either spinal cord, so lower motor neuron in spinal cord, anterior horn of spinal cord, or here in the brainstem nuclei, which is the cranial nerve nuclei. The lateral corticospinal tract, it crosses the midline. The anterior corticospinal tract is bilateral. Most of it is on the same side, but it can cross at the same segment of the spinal cord. Okay, so it does not cross in medulla. It crosses on the same segment of the spinal cord. And here corticobulbar, most of them is bilateral, but some of them can cross the midline, like the one that we saw in the cranial nerve 7, cranial nerve 11. Lateral corticospinal tract, they are important for the voluntary conscious movement of the limbs. Anterior corticospinal tract, they are important for the torso muscle, so this is important for posture and balance, so movements of the shoulder and hip girdles are part of this. And the corticobulbar is important for movements of head and neck. And these are the tracts that are coming from brainstem. These these are part of the medial pathway, and rubrospinal is part of the lateral pathway. So you have two different tracts for the vestibulospinal tract. The medial one is coming from the medial vestibular nuclei, and lateral one is coming from the lateral vestibular nuclei. Both of them are ending up in the spinal cord, and the medial one is bilateral, is ending up in the neck muscles, and the lateral vestibulospinal is ipsilateral, is going down all the way to the lower extremity, and it is activating extensor muscle, inhibiting flexor muscle. Both of them are for posture and balance. Reticulospinal tract is coming from reticular formation of brainstem, ending up in the lower spinal cord. Most of it is ipsilateral, but can cross, and they are important for the movement, for posture and balance. Tectospinal tract is coming from superior and also inferior colliculi, and ending up in the spinal cord. The movement, the supply of the muscles bilateral, so bilateral muscles of the neck, and it is important for coordination of the eye and head movements. So for visual or auditory reflexes. And finally, the rubrospinal tract is coming from the red nucleus and ending up in the spinal cord, and it crosses the midline, and it's important for the fine movements of the upper limb. And I have this spinal syndromes, and you can go to the canvas and give your answers there, and we will discuss the answers after the deadline.